Hello, today we are going to be talking about Jasper Tudor, the first Earl of Pembroke, and what he did to make England and Wales, and generally Britain now, what it is today. How he changed the world forever. Let's begin with his early life and family. Jasper was born to Owen Tudor, the cousin of Owen Glyndwr, one of the princes of Wales, and Catherine of Valois, the widow of Henry V. He had an older brother called Edmund Tudor, who was the first Earl of Richmond, and he was born on the 11th of June, 1430. Even though Edmund died in his 20s, he was an extremely important person in history, as he was the father of the creator of the Tudor dynasty, Henry VII. Jasper and Edmund were also said to have another brother, who was called either Owen, Edward, or David. We don't know this specifically, as no historical documents formally tell us the name of this child, but what we do know is at a very young age he went to learn how to be a monk, and didn't grow up with his family, so he didn't have the titles which his brothers had. We also know that they had a sister, who we think was called Margaret, who went to live in a convent at a very early age. Owen and Catherine decided to do this, to protect them from the War of the Roses, which we shall lead on to in a moment. Catherine had one son with her previous husband, Henry V, and this son became Henry VI, at just the age of 8 months. Because Catherine was a dowager queen, when she married Owen, no one made it public, so Henry didn't actually know that they were married until many years later. When he found out that they were married and they had 2 sons, he decided that they should have titles, being the king's half-brothers. Only they didn't just receive land and titles from the king. Edmund in particular was in his great favour, and to secure a claim with some more element of Lancaster, more about that in a minute too, Henry VI arranged Margaret Beaufort and his half-brother Edmund Tudor to be married. Edmund and Margaret married on the 1st of November 1455, when Margaret was just 13 years old. There was something special about Margaret though, and this is why Henry VI thought that she was best suited for his half-brother. This was because she was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, who was the 3rd son of Edward III. During this time there was a war going on between the 2 families within the royal family, York and Lancaster. Henry VI was a Lancastrian king, but the Yorkists, who were related to him, were really fighting for the throne, and at some points during his reign he even lost his title and then regained the throne. Besides Henry himself, Margaret was the last Lancastrian claim to the throne, and if he was to die with no heirs, then there would be no Lancastrians left, and the Yorkists would rule. Later on we will be explaining the family tree and how it all fits together. But for now, all you really need to know is that Margaret Beaufort was an heiress to the Lancastrian throne, and any child that she would have would be an heir to the Lancastrian throne and could potentially become the future monarch. Henry gave Edmund and Jasper everything, so they swore loyalty to the king and swore loyalty to the House of Lancaster. In 1456, both brothers went to fight for Lancaster, but unfortunately Edmund did not return. This left Jasper to look after Margaret Beaufort, who was 8 months pregnant with the future king, Henry VII. Edmund Tudor was confirmed to be dead on the 3rd of November, 1556. Not much after a year since he had married Margaret Beaufort. Under no circumstances is Edmund Tudor to be someone who was frowned upon, but he didn't actually do anything that significant. He, like thousands of other men at the time, fought for Lancaster. The only thing significant he actually did was be the father of Henry VII. Later on, towards the end of the documentary, I will give you a bit of an insight into why I think Jasper is much more important and should be much more respected than Edmund, even though, yes, he was the eldest Tudor brother, yes, he is the biological father of Henry VII. In a sense, he was kind of the grandfather of the dynasty, but that is debated as he never even met Henry VII. Before we continue to discuss Jasper, you need to know about the other important figures in his life, just like his sister-in-law, Margaret Beaufort. This is a simple way of saying how Margaret Beaufort's family tree actually works. So, Margaret Beaufort's father was called John Beaufort, and you would never guess what his father was called. John Beaufort, and his father was John of Gaunt. Now we're going to leave it there for a second and we'll come back to that in a minute. Now Henry VI's family tree goes like this. Henry VI, his father Henry V, and his father Henry IV, and then his father was John of Gaunt. But you may think that John Beaufort and Henry IV were full brothers, but they actually weren't. Henry IV was the son of John of Gaunt and his first wife, so there is no debate on whether Henry IV was legitimate. But John Beaufort was born to John of Gaunt and his third wife. Now, even though they were married, which would mean that John Beaufort is completely and utterly, undebatably legitimate, they weren't actually married at the time he was born. Now this leaves a very large debate on whether John Beaufort was legitimate. Now, if John Beaufort was said to be illegitimate, then this would mean that Margaret Beaufort was illegitimate, and her son Henry VII was illegitimate. Therefore, the Tudor dynasty is utterly and totally illegitimate. But, in the modern day, does that really matter? Not in the slightest. Also, using some rules from later on, some laws that were brought in by Richard III, this would mean that John Beaufort was completely and utterly illegitimate. But right now, we're going to try and forget about that, as we're looking at the Welsh element, not the English. During her lifetime, Margaret was married 4 times. First, before she was 2 years old, to a man called John de la Pole, who was the 2nd Duke of Suffolk. This marriage was later annulled by Henry VI. Secondly, in 1453, as we already know, she married Edmund Tudor. Next, she married Sir Henry Stafford, and after that was Thomas Stanley, who was the first Earl of Derby. He was quite significant, as he was basically one of the main reasons why Henry VII's army managed to overthrow Richard III's in the Battle of Bosworth. So, in a sense, he was quite significant as well. Not quite as significant as Jasper, which we will touch upon in many ways later. But he was rather important. She was also very passionate about education, and Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, the first Oxford college to admit women, is named after her and has a statue of her in the college chapel. This is probably a good time to mention that she was an extremely religious woman. She also founded Christ's College in 1505 in Cambridge and started the development of St. John's College. In preparation for this documentary, I went to go and see the tomb of Edmund Tudor in St. David's Cathedral. To add a bit of humour to this, I went at the most inconvenient time possible, which was during the Easter weekend. This meant that the chapel and the church wasn't open for long, but I did manage to get a quick picture with the tomb of Edmund Tudor. You can see that there is his coat of arms, which was on a previous slide, and also a picture of him on the top with some Latin around it. The image of him, which is on the top, is the most famous image of Edmund possible, When you search for Edmund Tudor on Google Images, that's generally the first one that comes up. I think there's a better picture of it on previously in the documentary. Now, back to Jasper. Growing up, more or less in hiding, he was quite an empathic and kind person. He was not at all, boastful or rich. Yes, he wasn't exactly a peasant, but he didn't grow up in a palace like the monarchs would have. He was trained to be an astute knight, just like his uncle, Owen Glendower, and grandparents, great-grandparents, all the way back to his ancestors, which served in the court of Llewellyn the Great. When Henry Tudor at that time was born, and his brother was dead, he took it among himself to serve as a father figure in Henry's life. This is something which people don't give him enough credit for, as he wasn't just there as a guardian to him, he was there as emotional support for him. Jasper spent the majority of his 20s and 30s in exile with Henry. This was in order to protect him, as he was the person who came up with the plan of overriding the monarchy, the Yorkist monarchy, I may add, and bringing the Lancastrians to power once more.